It was the second Monday of October, and the house smelled the way it always did on Thanksgiving, roasting garlic, butter browning in a pan, the particular warmth that comes from an oven that's been on since morning. I'd been up since 6. The turkey was mine to handle, same as every year. Same as the 23 years before my wife passed, and the 3 years since my son and his family moved back in. I didn't mind the cooking. Honestly, I looked forward to it. It gave me a reason to be useful before anyone else woke up. My daughter-in-law came downstairs around 9 in her robe, saw the counter covered in prep work, nodded at me, poured herself a coffee, and went back upstairs without saying a word. That was fine. She wasn't a morning person, and I had long since stopped expecting pleasantries before noon. My son came down at 10:30. He looked tired. He'd been looking tired for months, though I noticed it more when he was home, which was less and less. He sat at the kitchen island and watched me stuff the bird with the sage and onion mixture his mother used to make. "You need help?" he asked. "No," I said. "I've got it." He nodded and picked up his phone. That's the version of us I'd grown used to. Not unfriendly. Not warm either. Just two people sharing a house, orbiting around the same kitchen, the same hallways, the same driveway where his truck sat next to my old Civic. His kids, my grandchildren, 6 and 8 years old, were the reason I got out of bed most mornings with anything resembling purpose. They came thundering downstairs around 11, and suddenly the house felt alive, in a way it didn't manage to feel the rest of the time. My granddaughter wanted to help me make the pie. My grandson wanted to show me something on his tablet. I did both at the same time, rolling crust with one hand while watching a YouTube video about a kid who built a working hovercraft in his garage. It was a good morning. I want to remember that clearly it was a genuinely good morning, and I was grateful for it. My son's sister and her husband drove in from Airdrie around 2. That was the plan. Thanksgiving dinner at 5. Everyone around the table. The kind of afternoon that's supposed to remind you why family matters. I should have read the energy in the room more carefully. My daughter-in-law had been quiet all day in a way that was different from her usual quiet. There's the kind of quiet that means someone is tired, and there's the kind of quiet that means someone has been rehearsing something. I'd been around enough people in my 64 years to know the difference. I just chose not to think about it, because thinking about it would have ruined my morning. Dinner started well enough. The turkey was good, I say that without vanity. It genuinely was. The kids were well behaved. My daughter was telling a story about her drive down Highway 2, something about a deer that had wandered onto the overpass near Balzac, and everyone was laughing. My son poured wine. I had a glass of sparkling water. My knee had been bothering me, and I was on anti-inflammatories, so I'd skipped the alcohol. I don't remember exactly what shifted. It happened gradually, the way pressure builds in a room when no one is opening a window. My daughter-in-law made a comment about the neighborhood, something about property values on our street. My son added something about square footage. Then she said, casually, too casually, that the house was really too large for one person. I let that sit for a second. "It's not too large for all of us," I said. "Of course," she said, smiling. "That's what I mean." My daughter, to her credit, changed the subject. We talked about the kids' school, about some construction project her husband was managing, about the flames, and whether this would finally be their year. Normal dinner conversation. I relaxed. And then dessert came, and the kids went to watch something in the living room, and the adults were left with pie and coffee and the particular looseness that comes after a long meal, and my son looked at me across the table and said it. "Dad, can I ask you something honestly?" I said he could. He looked at his hands. He looked at his wife. He looked back at me. "What do you actually contribute around here anymore?" The table went quiet, the way tables go quiet when everyone suddenly understands that something irreversible has just been said. I set my fork down. Slowly. I remember being very conscious of setting it down slowly, because the alternative was something I didn't want to do at my own Thanksgiving table. "I'm not sure I understand the question," I said. He kept going. I think he'd told himself that if he started, he had to finish, so he kept going. He said that I'd retired 2 years ago, and since then, his word was adrift. He said that my daughter-in-law had mentioned that the house was getting cramped, that the kids needed more space, that it might make more sense for the property to be. And here he used a phrase I recognized, because it wasn't his phrase, it was hers. She'd said it to him, and he was saying it to me, reconfigured in terms of ownership. My daughter put her wine glass down. "Are you actually doing this right now?" she said to her brother. He told her to stay out of it. I sat very still. I have spent my entire adult life as a structural engineer. For 31 years, I designed load-bearing systems, bridges, overpasses, the kinds of structures where the math has to be exactly right or people get hurt. I understand, better than most, what it means when a foundation shifts. I felt something shift then, at that table, and it wasn't the house. "I contribute," I said, $3,200 a month in utilities, groceries, and property tax installments. I contribute 5 mornings a week of school drop-offs because both of your schedules don't allow for it. I contribute, and here I stopped, because I saw my son's face, and what I saw there wasn't shame. It was impatience. He was waiting for me to finish so he could make his next point. So I stopped. "Let me think about it," I said. Those were the last words I said at that dinner table. I washed the dishes. I thanked my daughter and her husband for coming. I hugged my grandchildren goodnight. I went to my bedroom, which was the master bedroom, the one my wife and I had shared, the one I'd lived in for 27 years, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I did not cry. I was past the age where that kind of pain came out as tears. It came out differently now. It came out as clarity. I want to try to explain what those next few weeks felt like, because I think it matters. I didn't get angry. That surprised me. Actually, I'd expected anger, and I didn't get it. What I got instead was something quieter and harder to name. A kind of inventory taking. I started paying attention to things I'd been choosing not to notice for a long time. The way my daughter-in-law spoke to me in my own kitchen, with her back half turned, as though I were a piece of furniture that had been in the wrong spot for too long. The way my son had stopped asking about my days sometime around March and hadn't started again. The way the grandchildren were gradually, almost invisibly, being steered away from me, fewer sleepovers in Grandpa's room, fewer Saturday morning cartoons on my couch, fewer of the small rituals that had made the last 3 years bearable. I pulled out a notebook, a paper one, the kind I used on job sites for 30 years, and I started writing things down. Not grievances, numbers. The house was assessed at just over $800,000. I'd paid off the mortgage 11 years ago. I'd bought it with my wife in 1997 for $230,000, which tells you something about Calgary in the 90s, and something about what a lifetime of careful living can build. My retirement portfolio was healthy. I had a pension from my firm and CPP and a non-registered account I'd been adding to since my 40s. I wasn't rich the way people mean when they say rich, but I was secure, deeply secure. The kind of secure that my son and his wife had apparently decided should be redistributed. I thought about what reconfiguring the ownership of the house would actually mean. It would mean my name off the title. It would mean my security, the only real security I had left after my wife died, handed over to 2 people who had looked at me across a Thanksgiving table and asked what I contributed. I'm a structural engineer. I know what happens when you remove a load-bearing wall because it's inconvenient. I also thought about my grandchildren. That was the hardest part. Not my son. I'd been grieving the version of my son I'd raised for longer than I wanted to admit. But those 2 kids. The girl who wanted to help me roll pie crust. The boy who wanted to show me his videos. They hadn't done anything. They were just kids. They deserved to have something that was genuinely theirs. Something no one could spend or squander or use as leverage. I made a decision. I made several, actually, but they were all part of the same decision. I called my financial advisor on a Tuesday morning when my daughter-in-law was at work and my son was on a job site in Airdrie. I told her I wanted to make some changes. She's known me for 18 years, and she's the kind of person who doesn't ask unnecessary questions, which is exactly what I needed that day. She listened, asked 3 clarifying questions, said she'd have the paperwork ready by Friday. Then she paused and said, "Are you all right, Gerald?" I told her I was going to be. The first thing I did was set up an RESP for each of my grandchildren, registered education savings plans, for anyone reading this who isn't Canadian. I put $40,000 into each one, 80,000 total. The accounts were in my name with the children as beneficiaries. Their parents could not touch them. That money would be there when those kids turned 18 and needed it, regardless of whatever happened between the adults in the meantime. I felt better the moment I signed those forms than I had in months. The second thing I did was pay off my son's truck. He still owed just over $19,000 on a Silverado he'd bought 2 years earlier. I called the financing company, got the payout amount, and sent a certified check. The ownership would transfer to his name, free and clear. I did this not because he deserved it, I want to be honest about that, but because his children would be riding in that truck for the next decade, and I didn't want them to lose that too if things went sideways financially. I was thinking about them. I was always thinking about them. The third thing I did was call a realtor I knew from a community association I used to volunteer with. Her name was Sandra, and she was discreet, which mattered. I told her I was thinking about selling the house, and I wanted to understand the process and the timeline. She came over on a Thursday when I was alone and walked through every room, making notes on her iPad. She told me the market was reasonable right now. She told me I could probably list at $860 and expect offers close to asking. She asked when I was thinking. I told her I wasn't sure yet. I was still deciding something. She left me her card. I put it on my nightstand and looked at it for 3 nights before I called her back. I need to tell you what happened in between those 3 nights, because it changed the specific nature of my decision. On the second Saturday after Thanksgiving, my son sat down with me in the living room after dinner. My daughter-in-law had taken the kids upstairs, and I knew this was by arrangement, because she had that look she sometimes got when things were being managed. My son was using his careful voice, the one he uses when he thinks he's being reasonable. He said he'd been thinking about our conversation at dinner. I said I had too. He said he understood it might have come across badly, but that he and his wife had real concerns about long-term planning. He said the property market in Calgary wasn't going to stay where it was, and that, from a practical standpoint, having the house in a single name, in an estate that would eventually go through probate, wasn't ideal for any of us. He said this like he was reading from a pamphlet someone had given him, which I suspected was more or less what had happened. I asked him what solution he had in mind. He said they'd looked into it, and the cleanest option would be to transfer the title into joint ownership, him and me, which would mean, when I passed, the house would go directly to him without the estate process. He said it like it was a favor he was doing me. I asked him about his sister. He looked at the floor. I asked him if his sister would also be on the title. He said they'd have to work that out separately. I sat with that for a moment. His sister, who'd driven from Airdrie to have Thanksgiving with us, who'd told her brother to stop the moment he started, who called me twice a week just to check in, she would have to be worked out separately, like a loose thread. I'll think about it, I said. Same words as before. Same quiet. He went upstairs. I sat in the living room for a long time, looking at the fireplace I'd installed in 2009, the built-in shelves I'd designed myself, the window overlooking the backyard where my grandchildren played in the summer. I had lived in this house for more than half my life. I had brought my wife home from the hospital to this house after her diagnosis, and I had held her hand in the bedroom down the hall when she left. The house knew everything about me. I thought about signing my name away from it, and something very calm and very final settled into my chest. I called Sandra the next morning. I want to be clear about the sequence of what came next, because I've thought about it many times since, and I want anyone listening to understand that I did not act in anger. I acted in the way I'd spent an entire career learning to act methodically, with full understanding of the load I was removing and the structure that would remain. I listed the house at $855,000. Because my son and daughter-in-law were living in it, Sandra advised a very specific approach. We would use a lockbox, showings by appointment only, and the listing would go live on a Friday afternoon when they were both at work and the kids were at school. She would handle all communications through my phone. My son didn't follow real estate listings. My daughter-in-law did, occasionally, but Sandra's assistant would handle any inquiries through a separate contact. The first showing was the following Wednesday. The second was Saturday. By the end of 3 weeks, I had 2 offers, one at asking and one $4,000 over. I accepted the one at asking because the buyers were pre-approved and had no conditions. The closing date was 60 days out. In the meantime, I'd been researching. I want to tell you about Prince Edward Island, because most people who haven't been there think of it as a place you go once for the Anne of Green Gables experience, and then you're done with it. That's not what it is at all. PEI is red clay cliffs and salt air and the longest beaches you've ever seen. And in October the light, there is the color of something you can't quite name. I'd been once with my wife, in 2003, and she'd said she wanted to live there someday. We always said, someday. We were going to retire there. Then she got sick. I'd been thinking about that trip for 21 years. I found a furnished rental in a small town on the North Shore, a converted farmhouse, 3 bedrooms, a view of the Northumberland Strait from the back porch. The landlord was a retired fisherman who rented it by the year to people who needed to get away from something without saying so. He asked me on the phone why I was interested in PEI in November, which is not exactly peak season. I told him I was a retired engineer from Calgary and I needed some quiet. He said, "You'll get that." Monthly rent was $1,200. I took it for a year. I shipped 2 boxes ahead of me. Books, some tools, my wife's blue cardigan that I still kept folded in the top drawer of my dresser. The cardigan went in the first box. Now, I have to tell you about the letter. I've written a lot of documents in my life, structural reports, technical specifications, project assessments. I know how to communicate clearly in writing. I sat down at my desk the night before I left and wrote 3 letters. The first letter was to my daughter. I told her everything, in sequence. I told her about the house sale, about the RESPs, about the truck, about the rental in PEI. I told her where I was going and how to reach me. I told her she was the best of what her mother and I had made, and that I was sorry for not saying it enough in the years since her mother died. I told her the executor information for my estate, because she would need it eventually, and I wanted her to have it from me directly. That letter was 3 pages. I sealed it, put her address on it, and left it with Sandra to mail the day after I left. The second letter was for my grandchildren. I didn't address it to the children themselves. They were 6 and 8. They couldn't read what I needed to say. I addressed it to whoever would be reading to them, and I wrote it as a story. I told them that their grandfather loved them more than he had words for, which was saying something because he had a lot of words. I told them the money in their RESPs was from him, and that it would be there when they were ready to go figure out who they were in the world, and that they should go figure it out somewhere interesting. I told them their grandmother would have thought they were extraordinary. That letter was 2 pages. I left it with Sandra as well, with instructions to mail it to my daughter. The third letter was for my son. I've thought a lot about whether to share what I wrote in that letter. I'll tell you the shape of it, if not every word. I told him that I understood he was under pressure I couldn't fully see, and that I believed his wife had significant influence over the decisions he'd been making, and that I didn't entirely blame him for following the path of least resistance in his own home. I told him I remembered the boy he used, to be cautious, earnest, the kind of kid who apologized to bugs before stepping over them, which had driven me crazy and also made me proud in a way I never told him. I told him I hoped he'd find his way back to something resembling that boy before his own children grew up and stopped recognizing him. I told him the house had sold. I told him the closing date and that he would need to make alternative arrangements before then, and that I was sorry for the short notice, though I wanted him to understand that the circumstances had led me here and that he would know what those circumstances were. I told him the truck was paid off, and that his children had RESPs, and that I wanted neither credit nor contact for any of it. The last line I wrote was this: I didn't disappear because I stopped loving you. I left because I finally started loving myself again. I sealed that envelope and left it on the kitchen counter, weighted down with the spare house key I'd been carrying on my keychain for 27 years. I flew out of Calgary International on a Thursday morning in mid-November. I had 1 carry-on and a personal item. The carry-on had 2 weeks of clothes, and my toiletry bag, and the structural engineering textbook I'd been meaning to reread for years. The personal item was a small backpack with my laptop, my documents, my retirement account information, and a photograph of my wife standing in front of the red clay cliffs at Cavendish, laughing at something off camera, squinting into the sun. I remember sitting in the departure lounge at gate D7 and feeling, for the first time in a very long time, like I was going somewhere rather than just staying. The flight to Toronto was 4 hours. The connection to Charlottetown was another 2. I slept for most of the first flight. On the second flight, I watched the cloud cover thin out somewhere over Lake Ontario, and I thought about my wife. I thought about how she'd have handled what I'd been through. She was sharper than me in the ways that matter. She would have handled it earlier, and with less sentiment. She wouldn't have waited for Thanksgiving. She would have noticed the shift in her son months before it announced itself at a dinner table, and she would have had a quiet, private conversation that probably would have changed the outcome. She was better at people than I was. I was better at structures, but she wasn't here. So I handled it the way I knew how, by understanding what was load-bearing and what wasn't, by removing only what needed to go, by making sure the things worth preserving were properly supported before I walked away. The farmhouse was exactly what the photos had shown, and nothing more. That was exactly what I needed. 3 bedrooms, one of which I immediately turned into something like an office. The kitchen was from the 1980s, and the appliances matched. The back porch looked out over a field, and then the strait. And in the mornings, the water was very still and very gray, and sometimes there were seabirds low over the surface. The first morning I woke up there, my real first morning, not the adjustment night where you're just grateful to have arrived. I sat on that porch with coffee and didn't speak to anyone, and didn't think about Calgary, and didn't check my phone for 2 minutes. I can't tell you how long it had been since I'd done that. The landlord's name was Douglas, and he came by after 3 days to make sure the furnace was running properly. He was in his mid-70s, deeply weathered in the way that people who've spent their lives near the water tend to be, with the easy and direct manner of someone who'd long since run out of patience for pretense. He showed me how the furnace had a particular quirk about the pilot. You had to hold the button for 12 seconds, not 10, or it would cycle off again. And then he stood in my kitchen and looked at me for a moment and said, "What kind of engineer?" I told him structural. He nodded slowly. Bridges? Bridges. Overpasses. Some stadium retrofits. He said his son was a civil engineer in Halifax. He said engineers were always looking at things and trying to figure out what was holding them up. I said that was a fair way to put it. He said if I wanted company at some point, there was a curling club in town that welcomed drop-ins on Wednesday evenings, and nobody would ask me anything I didn't want to answer. I told him I'd think about it. I went to the curling club 2 Wednesdays later. I was not good at curling. I had played perhaps 4 times in my life, and whatever modest skill I'd once had was entirely absent that night. But a man named Phil, who was 68 and had the kind of laugh that seemed to start somewhere around his knees, spent 40 minutes teaching me to properly read the weight of a throw, and we won 2 ends out of 6. And afterward, someone bought me a beer and told me that for a guy from Alberta, I didn't throw too bad. I told them I'd been a quick learner all my life. That was November. By December, I'd settled into something that felt, tentatively, like a rhythm. I woke up early. I had coffee on the porch regardless of the temperature, though I added a second sweater in December and a hat. I read for 2 or 3 hours every morning. I'd started working through the structural engineering textbook, which sounds like homework but was actually comforting. The equations were still right. The principles were still right. The world inside those pages had not been renegotiated behind my back. I cooked real meals, which surprised me. I'd told myself for years that cooking was something I did for other people, but it turned out I enjoyed it for its own sake. I called my daughter every Sunday. She was angry, initially, not at me, but on my behalf, and the 2 of us had a long conversation in early December where she said things about her brother that I won't repeat because they were probably accurate and I didn't want to compound the situation. She told me the closing on the house had proceeded normally. My son and his family had moved into a rental in the southeast end of Calgary. She said he'd called her twice. She said the conversations hadn't gone well. I didn't ask for details. Whatever was between them was between them. She told me the kids were okay. She'd seen them once since everything. The girl had asked where Grandpa went and had been told he moved somewhere new, which was true. The boy had asked if Grandpa was coming back for Christmas and had been told probably not this year, which was also true. I thought about them on Christmas morning. I was on the back porch with my coffee, and it was cold enough to see my breath, and the strait was completely flat and silver. And I thought about the girl, and whether anyone had let her help with the pie. I sat with that for a while, and let it hurt the way things that are true sometimes have to hurt. And then I went inside, and made breakfast and called my daughter, and we talked for an hour and a half, and she made me laugh 3 times, which is the right number. I want to tell you what I've understood since leaving, because I think that's the part that matters. I spent my entire career understanding load distribution, how weight moves through a structure, how a bridge transfers force from the roadway down through the piers into the bedrock. One of the first things you learn in structural engineering is that a structure under improper load doesn't always fail dramatically. More often, it deforms slowly. It accommodates, it finds ways to redistribute the stress that shouldn't be its to carry. And it does this quietly, without complaint, until one day the accommodation is no longer possible. I had been deforming for years. I'd been redistributing weight that wasn't mine to carry. I'd told myself it was love, and it was, but love isn't an infinite structural capacity, and I'd been treating mine like one. I'd been so focused on keeping everything standing that I hadn't stopped to ask whether what was standing was worth the load. My son asked me what I contributed. He meant it as a diminishment, but I've turned the question over many times since, and I think there's something real in it, even if he asked it wrong. What do any of us contribute when the things we've spent our lives building are finished? When the children are grown, when the career is over, when the partner is gone, when the house has been sold, and the moving boxes are unpacked in a farmhouse on an island you always meant to visit? Here is what I've found, 6 months into the answer. I contribute to the curling club on Wednesday evenings. I contribute bad throws and occasional good reads, and the willingness to buy the round sometimes. I contribute to the Tuesday morning walks along the cliff trail with Douglas and 2 other men whose names I've finally learned: Brian, who was a high school vice principal for 25 years, and Terrence, who worked for Environment Canada and can identify seabirds by their wing beat alone. I contribute to my own mornings, which are mine now in a way they haven't been in years. I contribute to my grandchildren's futures, silently, through 2 accounts they'll find when they're ready. And I think about my wife. I think about her standing on that cliff in 2003, laughing at something off camera, squinting into the sun. I think about how she would feel knowing that I finally made it here without her, and I believe I have to believe that what she'd feel is relief. Because she loved me, and she would have wanted me to stop holding up a structure that had already decided it didn't need me. There are days when the grief is sharp and specific, and very close. Not grief for my son, that's a different thing. Longer and duller and still unresolved, but grief for the version of things I'd hoped for. The Thanksgiving table that stayed warm, the grandchildren who would grow up knowing their father, the house that would have stayed mine long enough to matter. I let myself feel it. And then I go make breakfast. My daughter asked me, on one of our Sunday calls, if I had any regrets. I told her about the RESPs, about the truck, about the letter on the kitchen counter. I told her that I'd done what I could for the people who deserved it and had tried not to do damage to the people who didn't. I told her that the only structural principle I'd ever really believed was this: if you want something to stand for a long time, you have to build it on ground that can hold the weight. I'd been built on good ground once. I drifted. I was back. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mom would have come with you, you know. If she could have." "I know," I told her. "I know she would have." The sun comes up over the strait around 7:30 this time of year, and by 8, the light has that quality that my wife would have known the name for. She was better at words than I was. It goes sideways across the red clay and turns the field behind the farmhouse, the color of something just remembered. I stand on the porch with my coffee and I watch it. I'm planning to stay long enough to find out. I have a point. I've always had one. It just took me a little longer than it should have to remember where I'd left it.